Hello everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin, and we will be learning today, Mirz Hashem, Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis, hopefully a piece of Nun Zayin Amud Aleph as well. However, lately I'm seeing that I've been overly optimistic at the outset of this year as to how much we're going to cover, but I do think that today's material is relatively simplistic, so hopefully we will get to pick up a little ground. We're starting a new Siman today. We're beginning on Nun Vav Amud Beis with Siman Lamed Gimel. And today we're going to be discussing primarily damage that occurs to the Shel Rosh. Now, when we analyze a Shel Rosh, as we've seen already so many times, the Shel Rosh is comprised of four individual batim, right? Kadesh, V'haya ki v'yacha, Shema, V'haya im Shemaya. At least that is according to Rashi. Now, as we've learned and as we've mentioned so many times, the Shel Rosh is comprised of four actual independent batim. These are not just lines on the outside and on the top. If they would just be lines, the bias would be puzzle. These are actually four individual compartments. That being said, how many walls does the bias of the Shel Rosh actually have? There's a total of 8 walls within this bias. How so? You have one wall here at the outside of the first bias. The second wall is the interior wall of the first bias. The third wall is the wall of the second bias. The fourth wall is the second wall of the second bias. The fifth wall is the first wall of the third bias. The sixth wall is the second wall of the third bias. The seventh wall is the interior wall of the fourth bias. And the eighth wall is the exterior wall of the fourth bias. So, together with the exterior walls, going from one side to the next, we have 8 walls within the bias of the Shel Rosh. And then, of course, we also have the Gag. We have the roof of the Shel Rosh. And we have the other 2 sides of the Shel Rosh as well. What we're going to be discussing now is damage that occurs within the bottom of the Shel Rosh. So, with that Hakdama, let's begin Siman Lamed Gimel. Din Tikunei Tefillin, the halachas that pertain to the repairs of Tefillin, V'din HaRitzuais, and the halachas of the Ritzuais, the straps of the Tefillin, Ubai He Seifim, and here we have 5 Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Im Niskalkel Or Shel Shnei Batim Mibate Harosh. If the leather walls. Now, the Mechaber, interestingly enough, I find that here in Sif Aleph, both the Mechaber and the Ramah, if we are to learn them the way the Mishnah Berurah does, and of course this is a Mishnah Berurah share, so that's what we're going to be doing. And of course the Chavetz Chaim didn't invent this chas v'chalila out of whole cloth. The Chavetz Chaim took this from the Mefarshim, the Neisei Kalim on the Shulchan Aruch, as we can see in the Shar HaTzion. The phraseology of the Mechaber and of the Ramah are a little bit vague within this sif. So I'm going to be filling in the blanks, so to speak. The Mechaber says, "In Niskalkel Or Shel Shnei Batim Mibate Harosh." If the leather of 2 batim of the Shel Rosh becomes damaged. Now, as we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, we're talking here about the interior walls of the bottom of the Shel Rosh, not the exterior walls. So, what the Mechaber is talking about is, you have 2 of the bottom of the Shel Rosh, where, let's say, 2 bottom are next to each other. Let's say bias number 2 and bias number 3. And their interior walls have become damaged. They've developed a tear inside the interior wall. So you can't even see this damage from the outside of the bias. From the outside of the bias, everything looks fine. But if you would open up the bias and look inside, you'll see that there's damage. There are tears to the interior walls of the individual bottom. So says the Mechaber, If niskalkel or shel shnei batim mi bati rosh, if the interior walls of two of the bottom of the Shel Rosh have become damaged, zeh eitzel zeh, if this occurs to two bottom that are next to each other, so it happens, let's say, to bias number 1 and bias number 2, or bias number 2, bias number 3, bias number 3, and bias number 4, but two bottom that are next to each other, the walls become damaged. Says the Mechaber, what's the halacha? Im hatfilin yeshanim, if the tefillin are old tefillin, psulim, then the tefillin are puzzle. V'im heim chadashim, if, however, the tefillin are new tefillin, kisherim, then the tefillin remain kosher despite this damage. And then the Mechaber gives a caveat. This is true. Kol zman she'or moishav habatim kayom. This is true so long as the the leather of the base of the bottom, what's that? The titura. As long as the leather of the titura, right, the base of the tefillin, as long as the leather of the titura is not compromised, then this is okay. So what has the Mechaber told us? The Mechaber is addressing a case where the interior walls of two of the four bottom of the Shel Rosh that are adjacent to each other have become damaged. They have tears in them. What's the halacha? Okay, if the tefillin are new, they're kosher. If the tefillin are old, they're puzzle. Caveat, the titura has to be 100% intact. Now, first of all, what's the difference if the tefillin are old or the tefillin are new? So the difference, based on the Sugi and Menachos, seems to be, based on the Nemuke Yosef's explanation of the Sugi and Menachos, if the tefillin are new, then the fact that the leather has a tear in it does not indicate necessarily a weakness on the part of the leather. However, if the bottom are old and now they developed a hole, that is an indication that the tefillin are wearing out. And now we're worried if the leather is wearing out, then it's okay, let's say, that there's a hole inside, but as we're going to see, if there's a hole in the exterior of the bias, on the walls or on the gag, if there's a hole on the exterior of the bias, then the bias is puzzle. So the difference between new tefillin and old tefillin is, on new tefillin, the hole is not an indication that the leather is worn out. On old tefillin, the hole may be an indication that the leather is worn out, and if the leather is worn out, we're afraid that it might develop a hole in the gag or in one of the exterior walls. Okay, now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah for some greater detail. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut aleph, niskalkel. The Mechaber said the case over here is niskalkel or shel shnei batim mi bati rosh, that the leather of two adjacent bottom in the Shel Rosh became niskalkel. Niskalkel means damaged or ruined, but the Mechaber didn't specify what kind of damage. Explains the Mishnah Berurah Pirush, shenifsak v'nase kera. It became split and a tear formed in the hide. That's the kind of damage that we're speaking about. And we're talking about interior damage. So interior walls of the individual bottom became torn. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut and bays, mi batei rosh, avalim nase kera b'habayis shel yad. Right now, the Mechaber is addressing specifically the Shel Rosh. How about the Shel Yad? The Shel Yad is one bias. There are no interior compartments. Says the Mishnah Berurah, avalim nase kera b'habayis shel yad. If you get a tear in the walls of the Shel Yad, pasal l'kulei alma, that's 100% pasal according to everyone, b'chol inyan, no matter what happens, new, old, it doesn't matter. Avsha titura kayemes, even if the titura of the Shel Yad is completely intact, it's still pasal. V'lo dami l'Shel Rosh, and it's not comparable to the Shel Rosh, the nishtayer by oid al kol panim eza batim shalemim, because by the Shel Rosh, even if one or two individual bottom become compromised, you still have the other bottom of the Shel Rosh that are completely intact, and that saves the bias. But the Shel Yad is only one bias. If the bias becomes compromised, it's puzzle. Ois Cotton Gimel, the Mechaber said, we're talking about where two batim that are adjacent to each other became compromised. That's when we say that if the tefillin are old tefillin, they're puzzle, if the new tefillin, they're kosher. If one bias gets a hole, it seems that it's okay. If two batim get a hole, but they're not adjacent to each other, that's we're going to see is also okay. When do we have a problem? When it's two batim adjacent to each other. Now, first the Mishnah Berurah says, Zeh etzel zeh, Ritzayin Olaymar, da batim em smuchim zeh lo zeh. We're talking about two batim that are adjacent one to the other. But let's remember what I told you at the outset of the shir. Let's say that the damage that we're talking about over here is to bias number 2 and bias number 3. How many walls do they have? Each one has 2 walls. Bias number 2 has one wall that's adjacent to bias number 1, and it has another wall that's adjacent to bias number 2. Bias number 3. Bias number 3 has one wall that's adjacent to bias number 2, and it has a second wall that's adjacent to bias number 4. Now, we're addressing a case where the damage that has occurred to 2 adjacent batim. But do the tiers have to be adjacent to each other? Let's say the damage to bias number 2 is in its first wall, the wall that's adjacent to bias number 1. And the damage that happens to bias number 2 is to its wall that's adjacent to bias number 4. In that case, the damage to bias number 2 is over here. It's in this wall. The damage that's to bias number 2 is over here in this wall. You've got 1, 2, you've got 2 walls between this damage and this damage. Is that still the case that the Mechaber is addressing? Is that still a problem? Is that still damage that's to 2 batim adjacent to each other? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes. The damage does not have to occur to 2 adjacent walls. So it doesn't have to be that the damage is to this wall of bias number 2 and to this wall of bias number 3 so that the damage is adjacent to each other. Even if the damage to bias number 2 is over here and the damage to bias number 3 is over here, it's still to 2 adjacent batim. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzayin Olaymar, da batim heim smuchim zeh lo zeh. The 2 damaged batim are adjacent one to the other. Afilu imein hakaroim smuchim. Even if the tiers, the damage, are not next to each other. Kigoyin, for example, shekera echad ba'bayis hasheni. One tier is in the second bias, bedafnoi hayamini, on its right-hand wall. Vikera hasheni ba'bayis hashlishi. The second damage is to the third bias, loishna bedafnoi hayamini, whether it's to the right-hand wall, hasmali, or the left-hand wall. Either way, the damage is not adjacent to the damage that occurred to bias number 2. The damage to bias number 2 is in its right-hand wall. It's over here. Even if the damage that occurs to bias number 3 is in its right-hand wall, it's still not adjacent to the damaged wall of bias number 2. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says, if the damage occurred to the right-hand wall of bias number 2, it doesn't matter where the damage occurred to bias number 3, the 2 damages are still not adjacent to each other. But it's still problematic because it's 2 adjacent batim. Like the Mishnah Berurah says, Afilu im kera zelamaylo v'zelamato. Or maybe the damage to one bias happened up on top, and the damage that happened to the other bias is all the way down at the bottom. So the damage is not next to each other. Doesn't matter. The puzzle. Certainly, if the damage would mamish be right next to each other, so let's say the left-hand wall of bias number 2 is damaged, and the right-hand wall of bias number 3 is damaged, and the 2 damages are mamish lined up with each other. So you could, stick a pin straight between the opening of one bias and the opening of the other bias. The Mishnah Berurah says certainly that would be problematic. But the takeaway over here, the critical takeaway of Ois Cotton Gimel, is that the key factor is that the damage occurs to two batim that are adjacent to each other. But it doesn't have to be two defanois. It doesn't have to be two walls that are adjacent to each other. As long as it's two batim that are adjacent to each other, already we could be having a problem. Ice cut and dalit. So the Mechaber said it depends if the tefillin are old or if they're new. The Mechaber said Yeshanim, if the tefillin are old, psulim, then they're puzzle. Why? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, because this damage means the kvar niskalkalu machmas yoshnan, that these batim are becoming ruined due to their age. They're old and the leather is wearing out. Now he doesn't say so what, but he brings this down from the Taz. I'm just going to check the Taz again. I believe it's the Taz that says this. But if not, I know that the Rishonim say it. Let me just give a quick check over here. Gimel. In Sharetzion Ois Cotton Hay, he brings this down from the Taz, Sif Cotton Aleph, the Kvar Niskalkalu Machmas Yoshnon. No, I thought he explained it. He doesn't. But the Rishonim, let me see, I might have a reference to it over here. 1 second. Yeah, this comes from the Nemuka Yosef in Menachos. The Nemuka Yosef in Menachos says that the problem is, once we see that the leather is wearing out due to its age, we're now afraid that just like these holes occurred, the damage may spread to the exterior walls of the bias. Okay, let's continue Ice Cut and Dalit. Well, you know what? Before we continue Ice Cut and Dalit, let's go a little further in the Shulchan Aruch. So, second line down, a little past the halfway mark. Let's see what the Ramah says, because now the Mishnah Berurah is going to address the thinking of the Ramah. So the Mechaber said, you have damage to two adjacent batim. What's the halacha? If the tefillin are old, they're puzzle, and we're explaining from the Nemuka Yosef that the reason is because if they're old, we're afraid the leather is wearing out. The damage may spread. It may go up to the gag or to the exterior of the bias, and we're going to run into trouble. Now, if the tefillin are new, then the damage is not indicative of the wearing out of the leather. Therefore, we're not worried, and it's okay. Says the Ramah. First says the Ramah Haga, Gam habatim tzrichin lihiyos kayomim. The Mechaber said that one great caveat to this whole halacha is that the foundation of the bias, the titura, must be intact. We can't have any damage to the titura. The Ramah adds on to that, and the Ramah says, Gam habatim tzrichin lihiyos kayomim. Not only does the titura have to be intact, says the Ramah, but the ketzitza, right? The ketzitza is the upper box that contains the parshias. Says the Ramah, the ketzitza has to be intact. Now, what do you mean the ketzitza is intact? The whole thing that we're discussing over here is damage within the ketzitza. Yes, but the critical word is within. Says the Ramah, we're talking here about damage that's occurring within the bias. We're talking about damage to interior walls. But says the Ramah, the exterior walls must be intact. If we have any rips, any tears in the exterior walls of the bias, now it's puzzle. So that's the first addition that the Ramah made here. Gama batim tzrichin liyos kayomim. Ella shenikru ktas. The halacha that we're discussing over here is that it ripped a little bit. Again, it seems to be a little bit ikar chasar min ha-sefer in the phraseology of the Ramah. We're going to learn over here that what the Ramah means, that the batim akayomim ella shenikru ktas, means that on the exterior they are whole and complete and completely intact, and nikru ktas, they tore a little bit mi bifnim. Inside, they tore a little bit. Let's continue the Ramah. V'yesh omrim lehepech. And now, addressing what the Mechaber said, that if the tefillin are old, they're kosher. I'm sorry, if the tefillin are old, they're puzzle. If the tefillin are new, they're kosher. Says the Ramah, there are those that say quite the opposite. B'yeshanim kisherim, old tefillin are kosher, u'b'chadoshim psulim, and the new tefillin are puzzle. And the Ramah brings this down from Rashi in the Rosh, and the Ramah closes out his comment that he says, V'nira li, it would seem to me, the yesh lahachmir lifsal b'shteim, that we should be machmir, and we should say, we have damage to two adjacent batim, they're puzzle, no matter if it's new, no matter if it's old, it doesn't matter, they're puzzle. Now let's continue Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Dalid. So, in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Dalid, the first thing that the Mechaber said, that the Mishnah Berurah said was, why does the Mechaber hold that by old tefillin, the damage to two batim is a psol? Because he said the kfar diskalkalu machmas yoshnan, because that's an indication that the leather is old and it's getting worn out, and we're afraid the damage might spread. But by chadashim, we're not worried that they're worn out. What does the Ramah hold, who brings down from Rashi in the Rosh quite the opposite, that old tefillin are kosher and new tefillin are puzzle? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, the Ramah, who brings down this sheet of Rashi in the Rosh, holds fakert. The bechadashim, if the tefillin are new and they have damaged tears into adjacent batim, igloi milsa da'ar makulkalu. That means that this is inferior leather. You're making tefillin out of inferior, these are factory seconds. You're using inferior leather, and we're not interested in tefillin that are made out of inferior leather because we know that they're just going to be ruined in no time. Kaven de bizmat mu'at nikru. If we see that new tefillin became torn so quickly, then no, not interested. But yeshanim? If the tefillin tore after years and years and years and years of use, that's not an indication that it's inferior leather. It developed a hole on the inside. Who says it's going to develop a hole on the outside? For 25 years, I'm using these tefillin. They've been perfect. After 25 years, they developed a hole on the inside. Maybe it'll take another 25 years before it develops a hole on the outside. But if they develop a hole after a month, this is inferior leather. If it's inferior leather, I'm worried it's going to develop a hole on the exterior. That's the thinking of the Ramah. But now, says the Mishnah Berurah, but even if these rationales are not negaya at all, maybe, how about a case where the damage, we know for a fact that the damage was man-made. There's no question over here that it's inferior leather or that it's worn out. We know that the damage was man-made. Somebody took a razor blade and stuck it through. So it's not an indication that it's inferior leather. It's not an indication that it's worn out. So is that also a psul? Or do we say that that's not negaya? That doesn't make a psul. Mishnah Berurah says no. Even in cases where these two rationales, mamish, don't apply at all, when we know that the damage was man-made, still says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh lahachmir, you still should be machmir. Why? The Mishnah Berurah doesn't say. Now this is based on a Mordechai, and the Levush is mefarish to Mordechai, and the Levush says that the reason for it is because if we're talking about tefillin that are new, if we're talking about chadashim, maybe even yeshanim, I have to look back, but maybe even yeshanim, it could be that a man-made damage to the leather will weaken the leather. As long as the leather was intact, we're not worried that it's going to develop a hole somewhere else. But if you damage the leather with a knife, maybe that's the kind of damage that will spread. Nevertheless, continues the Chavetz Chaim, Tzidei b'Sefer Pischei Tshuva, the dibuk mehani im anu yoidin she'en ha'or b'kolkol. If we know that the damage was man-made damage, so we know that there's nothing inferior about the leather, then you could glue the tear back closed. And this would work even according to those who are machmir to make the tefillin out of or echad. And we saw that or echad is a whole shaila where the gluing takes away the mila of or echad. But when it comes to fixing a hole, you could use glue to close it up, and it's not a chesaron. Ois katan hey chadashim kisherim. The sheet of the mechaber was that if you have this damage to two adjacent batim, if they're old tefillin, it's puzzle. If they're new tefillin, they're ksherim. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cotton hay. Va'afilu akara b'shtei abatim b'shtei dafnei seim. This is true even if you have 4 damaged walls. So you have 2 damaged batim, and both of those batim are damaged on both of their walls. So you have 4 damaged walls, interior walls, not exterior. Interior walls. Still, if they're new tefillin, they're still kosher. Ois Katan Vav, the Mechaber said that the Moshav Habatim, the foundation of the batim, have to be kayam. What's the foundation of the batim? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu HaTorah, this is the Titura. Avol bebeis Yosef pireish. However, if you look in the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef doesn't say that it's only the Titura that has to be intact. The Beis Yosef says, the boish you shleimin mi aval Beis Yosef pirish the boish you shleimin mikol hatstadin, that the bias has to be intact on all of its sides. The loy machsherinon elamashenikre mi bifnim bein bias labias. It's this Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Vav that tells me that the opening line of Sif Aleph here in the Mechaber is only talking about interior damage. Because the Mishnah Berurah is bringing down from the Beis Yosef over here. The Mechaber wrote in the Shulchan Aruch that if you have damage to 2 adjacent batim, it depends if they're new tefillin or old tefillin. But he doesn't specify where is this damage. How about if there's damage to 2 adjacent batim, and one of the batim is the first bias, and the first bias has damage on its right-hand wall. That's an exterior wall. So do we say that if they're old tefillin, they're apostle, but if they're new tefillin, they're kosher? Lefi shitas HaMechaber? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Because if you look at the Beis Yosef says it's not only the titura that has to be intact. It's the titura and the ketzitza that have to be intact. So what does that mean? What kind of damage are we talking about? We're talking about interior damage, not exterior damage. The loy machsherinon elamashenikre mi bifnim bein bias labias. The only time we could say that the batim are kosher, despite the fact that they have tears, is if the tears are within, mi bifnim, inside, but not on the exterior. V'zeu gamkein das Ramah, and this is also the sheet of the Ramah shehetikay lahalacha that we bring down lahalacha. The Kosav and the Ramah wrote, the gam habatim tzrichin lihiyos kayamim ela shenikru uktsas. That's the meaning of the Ramah. When the Ramah says near the end of the second line, gam habatim tzrichin lihiyos kayamim ela shenikru uktsas, it means the way I explained it to you, that the batim are completely intact on their exterior, and they're only ripped a little bit within. Pirish shenikru ben bayis labayis. There are tears that have developed on the interior walls of the batim. Avalat stadim tzrichen liyos shleimim, but the exterior sides of the ketzitza must be intact. Va'afilu kara b'bayis echad, even if you only have a tear to one of the batim, im nasa mi bachutz, if that tear penetrates the exterior of the bayis lavad, gam kein neish lahachmir, you should be machmir, and those would be considered puzzle. Okay, we had the Ramah that was chaylik on the Mechaber. The Mechaber said that yeshenim are psulim. Damage to 2 adjacent batim will puzzle old tefillin, but not new tefillin. The Ramah said the opposite. The Ramah said no, it'll puzzle new tefillin, it won't puzzle old tefillin. And said the Ramah, we should be machmer both ways. Ois Katan Zayin, Livsol b'shneim, we should be machmer to puzzle both new tefillin and old tefillin if they have damage to 2 adjacent batim. Says the Ramah, Al Kain, based on this chumrah, yesh lifsoil, we should puzzle Mashirigilan as-Seifrim, something that the Seifrim have begun to do, says the Chavetz Chaim, Kisha Oisin ha'arba batim, when they form the 4 individual batim, v'noistin oisai b'defus, and they put the leather into a press. How do they make the 4 batim? They start with a flat piece of hide. They take a form that has 4 protrusions, and they stick it into the hide. They push it into the hide so that they push out 4 batim. So he says that what the Seifrim had started to do is, when they form the 4 batim with a tfus, with a form, they know initially when you put the batim in the form, the batim are hanging apart from each other. They're not what we have over here, a beautiful pressed together square, right? It's just 4 batim. I could even show you a picture in this Mishnah Berurah. There are pictures in the back. I could show you what it looks like. Oh, come on. Why could you never find something when you want it? Okay, here's a pretty good picture. See this picture over here? So they took the hide and they pushed it up into a tfus and they formed the 4 individual batim. But they're not pressed together. That's a later step in the process when they're going to actually take them and push them together and square them off. Right? So here you can see, over here in this picture, now suddenly the 4 batim are nice and rectangular and everything's been pushed together and you're starting to see something that's going to resemble our batim. But says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the problem that developed? The problem that developed was when you've got those 4 batim that are spread apart and you know that you have to push them together, what if one of the interior walls, the hide, the leather, on one of the interior walls is very thick? Maybe you see that in the middle of the bias, there's like a bulge. The leather is thick over there. Now, if you're going to try to squeeze these 2 batim together, you can't, because there's that bump in the leather that's going to force it apart. So what did the Seifrim do? They would take a knife and they would cut it. Sometimes you take a knife and you cut into the thickness of the hide. Sometimes you'll penetrate the hide. Now you've got a tear. Now, okay, if you've got a tear on one bias, no, memela. But what happens if it happens in more than one space? What happens if it happens to 2 adjacent batim that you cut into and you develop the hole? According to the Mechaber, it wouldn't be a problem. Because according to the Mechaber, these are tefillin chadoshim. They're new. So, okay, they're new, and therefore it should be kosher. But the Ramah says that new tefillin, damage to 2 adjacent batim, is possible. And we learned that that's even if we know that the damage is man-made. It's still possible, right? So the Sefer did this. He made holes in 2 adjacent batim. Now, the Chavetz Chaim says what the Seifrim would do is the Seifrim were making a mistake. The Seifrim thought that, first of all, it's not a problem because they're Chadoshim. They thought that we paskin maybe like the Mechaber. So it's Chadoshim and it's not a problem. So what they did was they didn't want anybody to see the damage. It's not going to look pretty. So they made sure that the damage was interior. They pushed that leather. Sometimes you can still manipulate the leather. If where the hole that they made would have been on the exterior, they pushed the leather inside. So it should be on the interior. But we're machmer like the Ramah, that even by tefillin chadoshim, damage to 2 adjacent batim is a psul, and even if it's man-made, it's a psul. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, al kain yesh lifsal masher regilan haseifrim kishaisen arba batim v'noisen haisa b'tfus choitchim min ha'or ben bayis labayis. sometimes they would cut away some of the leather between two bottom, kedei shelo yehi nichvatz ubeiletes, umechapen mekayim achtach, and they would cover up the area of the cut mibifnim by pushing it inside, kedei sheyanira mibachot shalim. Okay, now we have to go weiter in the mechaber. So, what have we said over here? We've said any damage to an exterior wall of the bias, it's puzzle. Even if it's damage to only one of the four individual bottom. Damage to two adjacent bottom, even if the damages are not adjacent to each other, they're on opposing walls of the two bias. But if you have damage to two adjacent walls, we have the machlokes, the mechaber, and the Ramah. Mechaber says, old tefillin puzzle, new tefillin kosher. The Ramah says fakert, new tefillin puzzle, old tefillin kosher. The Ramah says we're machmer both ways. But in any case, we have to know what constitutes old tefillin and what constitutes new tefillin. I mean, I guess to us it's not really negeya because we're machmer both ways, so it really doesn't matter. But the mechaber had to tell you what's new tefillin and what's old tefillin. So says the mechaber, ve'elu heim chadoshim. These are tefillin that are considered new. Anytime that if you would pull on the ritzuos, habayis mispashet, the bottom would spread apart, v'niftach and open up, nikra chadash, that's called new. Im einay niftach, if they won't spread apart and open, nikra yashan, that's called old. I believe what mechaber means is as follows. We have the ritzua of the Shel Rosh that goes through the mabarta. Now, what if I take the ritzuos and I pull on the ritzuos and I take, look what I'm doing with my thumbs. I have my thumbs on the bottom of the mabarta. I have the ritzuos in my fists. If I pull down on the ritzuos and I push up with my thumbs, what I'm actually trying to do is I'm pushing up the middle of the bias, which would force the bottom on the ketzitza, it would force the bottom to come apart, right? It would force the top to spread out because I'm putting pressure, but pulling on the ritzua and putting pressure with my thumbs, I'm putting pressure on the underside of the middle of the bias. That should force this apart. So says the mechaber, if it forces it apart, that means that the bias, that the bottom are new. They're still soft. They're still pliable. But if I can't spread it apart, then they're yeshanim, then they're already hardened and old. Okay, let's go weiter here. Well, you know what? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, ois katan ches, habayis mispashet, zeu la'oisan sh'oisan ha'ma'abarta be'or she'osu b'meno ha'batim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this test is only efficacious if the mabarta is one piece of hide together with the bias. So then when you put pressure on the mabarta, you're putting that same pressure on the leather of the bias. But if the mabarta is made out of a different piece of leather and is only glued together or stitched together, that doesn't put the same force on the ketzitza, and therefore this wouldn't be an efficacious test. Okay, let's go weiter in the mechaber. So we have discussed so far the case of damage to two adjacent bottom. Now says the mechaber, we're 4 lines up from the bottom, about 2/3 of the way through the line. Let's say 2 of the 4 bottom of the Shel Rosh were damaged, but they're not bottom that are adjacent to each other, right? It's bias number 1 and bias number 3, bias number 2 and bias number 4. Then says the mechaber, Rishain ushlishi. Let's say damage occurred to the first bias and the third bias. Kisherim, then the bottom are ksherim, afilu heim yishanim, even if they're old bottom. Niskalkalu shloisha bottom, but if 3 out of the 4 bottom became compromised, b'chol inyan psulim, then the bottom are puzzle. Doesn't matter if they're old, doesn't matter if they're new, they're puzzle. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. Rishaynu shlishi. Let's say two bottom became damaged, but they're two bottom that are not adjacent to each other. And the Mechaber's case was damage to bias number 1 and bias number 3. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out something very careful here. Ritzayna loymar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, the bazem mikri zeh shaloi keneged zeh. This is called that the damages are not adjacent to each other, because it's bias number 1 and bias number 3. Va'afilu im nasa hakera ba'bayis hashlishi b'shnei dafnoisav. Even if both walls of bayis shlishi, the right-hand wall and the left-hand wall, even if they're both damaged, it doesn't matter. Since the other damage is to the interior wall of bias number 1, it's okay. Why? Because there is an intact bias. Bias number 2, the walls of bias number 2 are completely intact. So you have a completely intact bias situated between the two damaged bottom, and therefore it's okay. But if bias number 2 and bias number 3 are damaged, even if the damage is, let's say, to the right wall of bias sheni, the kera sheni b'bias hasheni mismailai, and the second one is on the left of the second bias, so they're not next to each other. That's called zeh keneged zeh. Gimel. This is mamish a repeat of what the Mishnah Berurah said in Mishnah Berurah's cut and Gimel, that the damage doesn't have to occur to two interior walls that are adjacent to each other. The damage could be on two interior walls that are separated from each other by two intact interior walls. But the damage occurred to two bottom that are adjacent to each other. That's problematic. If you have 3 damaged bottom, then the bias is puzzle. Even if each one of those bottom only has damage to one of its interior walls, since you have 3 out of the 4 bottom that are compromised, it's puzzle. Yud Aleph b'chol inyan, no matter what. What does that mean, no matter what? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Bala Rabbis, afilu chadashim, even if they're new bottom, dehichsharnu le'el b'shtayim, afilu b'zeh eitzel zeh, even though the Mechaber opened up by saying that even if you have 2 damaged bottom adjacent to each other, if the tefillin are chadashim, they're kosher. Now says the Ramah, says the Mechaber, but if you have 3 damaged bottom, then the bias is puzzle, even if they're chadashim. The kamakan b'shloisha puzzle. All right, I thought we might get a little bit further, but like I said, sometimes I'm overly optimistic. So we'll stop over here with Sif Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. Discuss of Limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. From Rosh Hashanah, Yeshua Sefuas Parnasset Sheduchim to all in need. We should be zeichet to see the Biaskel Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.